Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Robin and Lakshmi, thank you for inviting me. Today, I'd like to share some work from my new book on embodied activism and talk about how the cultivation of something called somatic bandwidth can help us metabolize rage, harness love, and strengthen our relational capacities that desperately, in a social context, that desperately needs tools to engage and deepen our humanity. In the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to have a look at what is embodied activism, social discord and emotional misattunement, emotions and the body, metabolizing emotions, and somatic bandwidth as a tool for humanity. We'll also have some time for questions at the end. First, I want to unpack what I mean by activism and have a look at where it operates. Activism, which I'm going to define as any activity whose intention and effect is transformational social change, can occur at the macro, meso, and micro levels of society. In other words, the macro level of social institutions and legislation, the meso level of communities and organizations, and the micro level of individuals and small groups. And in this talk, I want to focus on the micro level and discuss an approach to activism that centers our everyday experience of power relations. And more specifically, I want to introduce a form of microactivism that offers tools for exploring and transforming the political realities of our daily lives by harnessing the felt experience of our bodies as the foundation of our change efforts. So embodied activism brings together the work being done in somatics, which is a field centered on developing concepts and techniques that highlight the subjective felt experience of the body, and social justice work. And a key tool in these efforts is the cultivation of somatic bandwidth, a term that describes a broad capacity to experience, express, and hold space for the bodily sensations of human emotion, including love and rage, in the context of difficult conversations, complex identities, and ancient patterns of relational harm. So let's talk a little bit more about the relational underpinnings of embodied activism. First off, I'd like to take as a given that oppressive social systems inherently create relational conflict predicated on the inequitable distribution of power and an ideological intolerance of difference. As a result, we are not all equally assured of safety, belonging, and dignity within these systems. Living within them often means feeling disconnected from those who are not like us, with few tools for navigating these differences. In other words, social discord is baked in. I'm also going to argue, so is disembodiment. Disconnection from the inner felt sense of our bodies is taught both through explicit instruction and implicit social norms. As early as childhood, we learn to discipline our body movement, modify our nonverbal communication, and manage our body images in order to be accepted, all while learning to largely ignore the ongoing stream of sensations, feelings, and impulses coming from inside our bodies. For some of us, the disconnection from our body is also the result of the dissociative effects of trauma, of oppression, and our bodies become a painful reminder of feeling overwhelmed by situations that we've had to live through. But being disconnected from how we feel in our bodies doesn't serve us in the midst of social discord, when we're struggling to work through feeling disconnected from others. When our lived experience of unjust power differentials isn't recognized or understood by someone else, or when we don't understand, or even worse, care to understand their experience of injustice. This is not just an intellectual or practical problem. A failure to grasp the painful emotional charge that undergirds the lived experience of oppression has relational consequences. Now, relational ruptures due to emotional misattunements are inevitable. Research by developmental psychologist Ed Tronick characterizes human relations as comprised of 1 million moments of affective attunement and misattunement. His research highlights the inherent messiness of human relations, but more importantly, it emphasizes the crucial role of reattunement in developing agency and resilience. This reattunement needed for relational repair requires authentic presence and emotional availability. We've all had the experience of someone saying or doing all the right things in a conflict, but we don't feel any better because we sense the other person isn't being fully present, honest, or open. Most of us also probably know what it's like to have someone's emotional response to conflict absolutely flood the relational field so that it doesn't feel like there's any room for our feelings. Authentic presence and emotional availability means that we're able to experience and acknowledge our own emotions while witnessing and making space for the emotions of others. This emotional availability requires the capacity to metabolize emotion, something that we're going to talk about in a bit. And when we make space for emotion, the repair that follows the rupture actually strengthens our working alliance with that person. There's lots of research on this topic in the psychological literature, even suggesting that relationships with repaired conflicts are stronger than those without conflict. So, now that I've laid the groundwork for an argument supporting emotional attunement as a tool for humanity, let's dig a little deeper into emotions themselves, and in particular, into their embodied nature. Despite the fact that they can be messy, scary, unpredictable, and inconvenient, emotions serve a purpose. Emotions orient us and help us interpret the world, letting us know what's dangerous and what's nourishing. They make life meaningful, exciting, beautiful, and challenging. For example, we can think of love as an emotional response to the presence of something that's nourishing, fulfilling, or affirming. Love nudges us to open up so we can drink in nourishment and care, like a flower opening to warmth and sunlight. On the other hand, fear can make us contract. The sensation of fear in our body alerts us to possible threat, giving us a rush of adrenaline that mobilizes us to protect ourselves. That said, when we're flooded with fear, it's not always possible to distinguish between unsafe and uncomfortable, which is a necessary distinction when we're trying to repair relational rupture and co-create brave spaces that embrace difference. Anger can be understood as an embodied response to a boundary violation, to being invaded and attacked, or to being abandoned, excluded, and ignored. A rush of anger helps us reach out for what we deserve and push away what hurts us. And it's important, I think, to recognize that even though they often travel together, anger is not the same as violence. Anger is a feeling in the body, and violence is an external action, a behavior resulting in harm. In other words, I'm arguing that it's possible to be angry and even express anger without doing harm to others. Lastly, sadness. It prompts us to slow down, turn inward, and reflect on a loss, disappointment, or failure. Sorrow can help protect us from further hurt by prompting withdrawal, or help us heal from an emotional injury by prompting us to reach out for care. For example, according to Benjamin Perry, who researches crying, emotional tears actually have a higher protein content than irritant tears, which makes them fall down our cheeks more slowly, increasing the chances that they'll be seen by others and elicit care. Again, our emotions serve a purpose. That said, we all have different capacities for experiencing, recognizing, and tolerating emotion. Inherent neurodiversity, cultural norms, and personal experiences all shape how we feel and deal with emotion. For example, if I was raised by a parent who flew into alcoholic rages, my comfort with anger might be compromised. Or maybe I was raised with cultural norms that discourage the expression of sadness based on my gender identity. Perhaps my emotional expression has been policed due to my membership in a subordinated social group. Maybe I'm dealing with personal or intergenerational trauma that makes some emotions feel unsafe or overwhelming. It's crucial, I think, that these important differences be acknowledged and respected as we explore our emotional landscape. So I'd like to invite us all now into a reflective writing exercise designed to dip into that exploration of emotional range just a little bit, if it feels right to you. Entirely optional. As a dear colleague of mine often says, do what feels right, and choosing is more important than doing, right? Okay, but if you're willing and if it feels comfortable, take a moment and just settle in. Maybe turn your attention inward just a bit and take some time and space just for you. If it feels right to soften your gaze or close your eyes, you can do that as well. Just what feels right. And remember that we're all different. Our emotional landscape is profoundly shaped by contexts we did not create or choose. So for the answers I'm going to invite you to reflect on, there are no bad answers. So I'd like to invite you into a reflection on emotion, on anger, sorrow, delight, disappointment, remorse, love, confusion, enthusiasm, jealousy, shame, hope. As you reflect, I'd invite you to be curious about which emotion is the hardest for you to access in yourself. Is there one that you can't feel very much, even when you think the situation demands it? What emotion is hardest for you to witness in others? You know, the one that sends you running for the hills or provokes a shutdown or a meltdown when you encounter it in the room. What's your go-to protective emotional response? The feeling that bubbles up first when there's trouble. Are there emotions that you are especially comfortable with, that you find easy to access and to be with? And are there emotions that you'd love to be able to feel or express more? Let yourself consider what comes up in response to my questions. And when you're ready, taking your time, perhaps jot down some thoughts in a notebook or on your phone, just whatever feels right. And as you do that, you might want to notice how your own history and social contexts have shaped your emotional landscape? All right. And as I invite you to bring your attention back to the room, I just want to acknowledge that there may have been answers or questions that surprised you a little bit or brought up a wave of feeling, right? So in just closing this experience, I'd like to invite us all to take a breath. Yeah, and maybe if there's something that needs shaking off or stretching out. Yeah. Just to give you a moment to shift gears from that very inner and maybe very feeling full experience to being back out in the room with the rest of us. You might want to put your feet on the ground, offer your body some care, just whatever feels right. So I want to add one more piece, and that is that we experience emotion in our bodies. There's actually lots of really interesting research in affective neuroscience on this. And according to neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, it's the mind's recognition of certain bodily sensations that helps us connect consciously and identify an emotion. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett argues that emotions are actually not hardwired in our brains, but are actually interpretations of sensations arising from our bodies, and that we learn how to differentiate these sensations and assign meaning to them. Further deepening the connection between emotion and the body is research finding that social and physical pain actually share common physiological mechanisms. MacDonald and Leary put forward the hypothesis that social exclusion is experienced as physically painful because reactions to rejection are an evolutionary development to help social animals respond to threats to inclusion. When you were doing that inventory of your own emotional landscape, were you aware of sensations in your body that corresponded to the emotions that you were tuning into? Let's take a look at some common ways that emotions are experienced in the body. When a team of scientists in Finland asked nearly 4,000 people in over 100 countries to map out where they felt different emotions in their bodies, the results were surprisingly consistent, even across cultures and age groups. In the graphic here, the cool colors, sort of the black and the blue colors, represent areas of muted sensation, whereas the warmer colors represent areas of increased sensation. So you can see how depression, which is in the bottom row, that very cool blue figure, suggests that there isn't much happening in the body, that depression is actually a decrease in overall body sensation. And in contrast, happiness, which is in the middle of that top row, suffuses the body overall with sensation. And you'll also see how anger, which is in the top left, really activates sensation in the hands and the arms. So that notion of anger being a response to a boundary violation, activating the arms to reach out or push away. And you can also notice perhaps that shame, which is in the bottom row, second from the right, just activates just the central body core. So I'm curious, does seeing these illustrations help you notice where emotions live in your body? Or do they live in different places for you? Just a place to get curious and to connect with, what's my relationship with emotion and the body? And there's an implication for this for me, which is when we understand that emotions are embodied experiences rather than cognitive brain events, it means that we can work directly with the body to help us explore, understand, and transform our emotional responses to challenging situations. The body becomes a way to help us navigate these interactions. So let's take a moment and have a look more closely on how this can happen. I want to talk about metabolizing emotions. So for me, to metabolize something means to break it down into components that can be used for nourishment. Yeah? When we metabolize our emotions, they're good for us. Even the ones that might be scary, challenging, difficult, challenging. Yeah? And we can learn something important from them, and we can use how we feel about something to shape and support our actions. In contrast, unmetabolized emotions can be understood as stuck response patterns that aren't responsive to the complexity of a new situation and may be discharged in ways that are hurtful or unsatisfying. So, how can we learn to listen to the body to unravel these stuck emotional response patterns and create new possibilities? I'm going to propose 3 steps. And I'm going to suggest that the first step is to follow the feeling. Now, sometimes the feeling that we're following is really big, so it can be helpful to just help it settle by breathing and grounding. And if the feeling that we're wanting to work with is still really big, it can be helpful to externalize it first, walking it off, shaking it off, or talking it through. But once we've got a little bit of breathing space between us and the emotion that we're following, we can follow it by noticing the physical sensations associated with it. Shakiness, heat, lethargy, agitation, actual heartache, right? The physical sensations that go with the emotions. And by attending to these situations as they move through our bodies, it can be really helpful to try not to get caught up in them, but just noticing the sensory qualities with curiosity and care. As we follow where the feeling takes us, without an agenda or without interruption, we begin to notice the emotion's deeper meanings, complex layers, and underlying value. And of course, next is to care for the underlying injury, because there almost always is an injury underneath a painful emotion, and those are mostly the ones that we're going to want to explore and metabolize. And I want to make a distinction here. I want to make a distinction to suggest that the emotional pain is not the same as the injury. Rather, the pain is a signal to attend to the injury, to give it space, comfort, love, and understanding. And this care can be very concrete and physical. And you might have noticed that we did a little bit of that at the end of the exercise on the emotional landscape. Breathing, grounding, touching, shaking, and orienting. The injury that the emotion points to will almost always be relational, even when it is also structural. For example, sometimes the injury is not directly inflicted by another person. Sometimes it's inflicted by a company policy, or by the media, or by a cultural norm. But when we care for our emotional injuries, they can heal. This healing then sets up the necessary conditions to meet the world more responsively, strategically, and ethically, rather than just reactively. And I'm going to suggest that we know when we've metabolized an emotion, when in the face of it, we can still act in alignment with our values and vision, even under the same old pressures. The third strategy and step is to address the relational conditions that cause the injury. This step might well include expressing the emotion that we're feeling in the situation that provoked it. But usually, we also need to do something to change the relational pattern that caused the pain in the first place. And when we change the pattern, that is the institutional structure, the corporate policy, or the interactional behavior. We prevent the same injury from occurring again to ourselves and to others. Now, of course, sometimes it's not possible to change the external conditions or the person that have hurt us, right? But we can almost always shift something about the situation, even when that shift is mostly within us. For example, next time, I'm not going to engage. Next time, I'm getting help. Next time, I'm not going to spiral into shame. Next time, I'm going to speak up. Every shift we make changes the pattern, both emotionally and relationally. On the other hand, if I have little embodied capacity to metabolize my own feelings, my fear, my grief, my rage, I won't have much room for those feelings when they get triggered. Instead, typically I'll need to suppress my emotions and pretend that I'm fine, or project them onto others, or immediately discharge them. And if I can't make space for my own feelings, chances are pretty good I'm not going to be able to make much space for yours. And when those inevitable relational ruptures, the misunderstandings, misattunements, and microaggressions occur, isn't that what we're really looking for? Not someone who can offer a compelling ideological analysis of the situation or provide a lip service apology, but someone to witness, acknowledge, and make space for our feelings. Someone who's willing to be with our pain empathetically, even just a little bit. We need someone who's able to hold both our love and our rage. In other words, someone who can show us through their own embodied capacity for authentic presence in a charged situation. I get you, and I got you. So I want to bring this all home and wrap it up with some thoughts on the cumulative effect of this process of metabolizing emotions in and through the body, in the context of relationships shaped by the forces of social injustice. Over time, I'm going to argue that this process makes possible a development of something that Lisa Feldman Barrett calls emotional granularity, and I describe as somatic bandwidth. Somatic bandwidth is about the inner and relational spaciousness created when we're able to intentionally pause and attune to the emotional sensations in our own bodies and in the room. It's about both capacity and flexibility, that is, bandwidth, in how we navigate complex relational worlds by strengthening our ability to feel and expanding the choices that we have available to respond to the challenges that life brings us. Being able to feel and follow emotions in our body can help us reframe our automatic responses to these sensations, adding nuance and malleability to our emotional landscape and our emotional interactions with others. So, beyond the ability to metabolize, that is, find nourishment and meaning from our emotions, somatic bandwidth can also be cultivated by appreciating the positive emotional impact of micro-connections and micro-resistances. Let's take a moment just to feel into that for a bit. I'd like to invite you to think of a time when you were able to make a connection with someone, even a small connection, in a way that allowed both your emotions to breathe, in a way that made space for how both of you were feeling. Or a time when you were able to use your emotions to fuel the righting of a wrong in a way that felt centered, grounded, and full of integrity. Notice how your body feels. Thank you. I'd love to take your questions if you have them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Lots of really thought-provoking concepts were shared. I'm curious about this idea of metabolizing our emotions and using them as fuel and making space, I guess. I think I understood the steps as sort of like processing them and like creating some distance from them and being able to move forward. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on sort of using them as fuel, metabolizing, like, energy for something else, et cetera, or the bandwidth. Like, are we trying to build our bandwidth? You know.
Yeah, good question. And you know, in a talk of 30 minutes, I wasn't able to elaborate on what does that metabolizing an emotion process really look like. But I think you're right. I think that the intention is to create enough spaciousness, like literally in our own bodies, in the sensation of our own bodies, so that the emotion that we're feeling isn't bigger than us. I think when our emotions get bigger than us, we lose choices. We lose that possibility to go, so yeah, absolutely. I might use my love or my rage or any other emotion, my sense of injustice, anything to fuel my actions. And in fact, I'm arguing that we need to be thinking about how do our emotions inform the choices that we make, not just what we're thinking about, not just intellectualizing a problem that we want to solve, but actually allowing our bodies and our feelings to help shape and guide our actions. I think for me, the important distinction is that when I'm in the grips of a feeling that's bigger than me, I can be driven by it in ways that are really more about, I need to get this thing out of my body, right? It's too much, I'm overwhelmed by it, I can't think clearly, I can't be strategic, I can't act in accordance to my own values and principles because this emotion is driving me. And so I think there's a real difference between having an emotion drive us and having an emotion fuel us. Yeah? Does that make sense? Yeah. Great, thanks. Yeah.
I felt like I was very soothing too. You have such a soothing voice. It was cool.
I've been doing this a long time. I used to work in student crisis response.
I can tell, it's wonderful. So I was thinking a lot about shocking emotions between parents and children.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you think about in organizations, managers are like the parents and the employees feel powerlessness and like the children, these dynamics. And I just wanted to hear how you've used this in organizations and just give a quick example. I've been doing some training of supervisor support for work and family.
Yep.
And people whose supervisors have been trained to be more supportive,
Yep.
the employees, some of them that have need for the intervention before, report less physical pain after they've had a trained manager. So like, I thought that was interesting. How have you used your work with organizations?
Yeah. I'm gonna loop back and just pick up on the thread that you raised about parents and children. And and underscore this notion that because of the similarity in the power dynamic in organizations, the supervisor-employee relationship can sometimes look an awful lot like and evoke in us our own histories, our own comfort and discomfort, our own capacity to role model or not, a dynamic where we're able to navigate the inevitable affective ruptures, right? It's going to happen. It's going to happen in an organization that we're not always going to be aligned. Some people are going to want some things and other people are going to say, no, we need to do this. And how do you navigate both the power dynamic and the feelings that come with it? And so it sounds like part of what you're doing in organizations is helping supervisors be more supportive. And I would add to that, that simply giving supervisors a directive to be more supportive without recognizing that they've got feelings and they're having reactions and they may not be entirely comfortable in their supervisory role, and they had really, unfortunate modeling growing up as a kid about how to hold power ethically and responsibly and relationally and all the rest of that stuff. So it seems to me that one of the ways that we can use this work and the ideas that I presented this morning in an organizational context is to help supervisors, not just, but to your question, is to help supervisors recognize when the feeling in their own bodies is too much for them to actually be able to navigate the interaction well. And when they need to take space and come back to an interaction, come back to a situation when they've got some breathing room around their own feelings about it. And I would argue you could take that a step further and help them come up with resourcing strategies to help them settle emotions that are too big or too complicated or historically too painful for them to manage well. Yeah? Yeah.
So I'm going to apologize in advance for the slightly inchoate nature of my question. But it started to coalesce during the inventory activity, and I wonder, it feels like actually all of the sort of activities that you walked us through and a lot of your thinking seems to, I don't want to say assume, but also sort of almost require, and I was initially going to say emotional intelligence, but I think that's wrong. What I really want to say is emotional literacy.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So what do you do, particularly in the organizational context, but just in any context, where the markers of success, right? You talked about the modeling and the training. So the markers of success have required folks to actually lose their emotional literacy, so they're not able to categorize those things. You were asking me questions like, which emotions do you access? I have no idea. I don't know what I'm feeling. I don't know. I feel neutral all the time because I'm really good at being professional, and that's what I'm supposed to do. So I'm just wondering how you access these tools when the modeling has been that if you're successful, if you're good at any job, except for actually emotional support jobs, being able to read yourself and recognize things like, I have an emotion, this is what the emotion is, and now it's outside of my ability to be productive. How do we still use these when that is the dominant emotional settlement that we have demanded in all of our sociocultural spaces?
Thank you for that, because I really did focus more on what happens when an emotion is too big, and what you're suggesting is what happens when it's too small, like what happens when it's not there, like how do I even manage? Or it is there, I don't know what it is, I don't know what to do with it, and part of my thesis, if you will, is that doing emotional work, particularly in a professional setting, might be challenging, might feel too vulnerable, like too much. And so part of why I think being able to access the body and use the body as a route to becoming more emotionally literate can be helpful, so that we can actually give folks in organizational or in workplace settings physical tools to help them build emotional tools. The capacity to, can you put your feet on the ground and feel your feet? Can you take a breath? Are you aware of the sensations of your breath? All of that, what I would call somatic literacy, builds emotional literacy, because emotions are actually interoceptive sensations. They're physical events. And so for me, it's a practice, but being able, not always, but sometimes being able to access really simple, concrete physical practices rather than suggest people do deep emotional work in an organization can help give us a way in.
Hi, Dr. A. Thank you for your talk. This is a kind of nerdy question. It has to do with the images that you showed
Yes.
where the emotions show up in the body.
Yes.
And I noticed that for some, not just with the cool and the heat, but also what happens in your upper body versus your lower body, what happens at your core versus your like distal ends.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of the mapping of that and
Yeah.
the science of that?
Yeah. I don't know a whole lot about the study that came out of Finland that these graphics are from, except that I tend to use them in my work not as a prescriptive map of, oh, this is where anger is. If you're not feeling anger in your body here, there's something wrong with the way you need to fix that. So I use this graphic mostly just to help folks go, oh, that maybe that doesn't fit, but oh, that kind of resonates. Like, oh yeah, when I see the colors, when I see the images, I can hook into a corresponding bodily sensation. And it's a strategy that I use overall in my work simply because, to your earlier point, we are so socialized to be disembodied, so deeply socialized to be disembodied, that sometimes even the invitation in a relatively safe setting with a very calm, soothing voice is actually not enough to help us actually feel something. And so I will use that image and other images as a prompt rather than a map. Does that help? Yeah.